Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to People's University live stream, Bugs and People. This is our fourth class. We'll be talking about a very large order, the beetles, tonight, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I want to remind you that this Tuesday, June 22nd at noon, Robin Yoakum will be joining us. His novel is called The Sacrifice of Lester Yates. Now, I have an announcement to make, which is that will be our first in-person program at the library since all this started. And so Tuesday at noon, you're welcome to come if you're vaccinated. And we will also be live streaming. So that'll be a hybrid program this Tuesday. And we're going to give it a shot, see how it goes. So please join us one way or the other. And then next Thursday on this broadcast, PU live stream, which will continue to be live streamed because we have professors from all over the country. We'll be talking about Hymenoptera, bees, wasps, and ants with the new president of West Liberty University, W. Franklin Evans. So that will be next week. Now, tonight, if you ask a question of Dr. Evans, whom I will introduce in a moment, you will win one of two prizes if your name is drawn at the end. A ladybug adoption sort of from the World Wildlife Fund. You get 3 plushy ladybugs and some other gifts. Or you will win Dr. Evans' book on the beetles of Eastern North America. And he has a new book that he'll tell you about, I'm sure, about the Western beetles. So without further eloquence, I will introduce to you Dr. Arthur Evans.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to share with you my inordinate fondness for beetles today. First, a little bit about myself. I'm a trustee and research associate at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. I'm also a research associate at the Smithsonian and the California State Collection of Arthropods. I'm an adjunct professor here in Virginia at Randolph-Macon College, University of Richmond, and Virginia Commonwealth University. I grew up in Southern California. I've studied insects for more than half a century, which means I got a really early start. I earned my bachelor's and master's degrees at Cal State Long Beach and my doctorate in entomology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. I've always had a long-standing interest in informal science education, and when I returned home from South Africa, an opportunity came along to create an insect zoo from scratch at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and I was the director there of that zoo for 10 years. I moved to Richmond in 2000, where I work as an entomologist, an educator, lecturer, author, photographer, consultant, and radio broadcaster. I love being an entomologist because the work is so varied. I get to do lots of things. I get to meet lots of great people. I research insects, primarily beetles. I photograph them. I write about them. I speak about them on the radio. I teach students about insects in the classroom, and I like having lots of different things to do. I've been involved in a number of book projects as an author, editor, or contributor. And my latest book, which will be out in August, is Beetles of Western North America. So one of the prizes tonight is the companion volume, Beetles of Eastern North America, which will certainly be applicable to beetles east of the Mississippi River. While this book, Beetles of Western North America, applies primarily to beetles found west of the Continental Divide. So let's dive right in. Beetles belong to the insect order Coleoptera. Beetles are the most numerous of all animals, with about 400,000 species worldwide and about 25,000 species in the United States and Canada. As adults, they all have hard, leathery forewings called elytra. Most species have a delicate pair of membranous flight wings folded underneath the forewings or the elytra. Both the adults and the larvae typically have chewing mouthparts and feed on a wide variety of plant and animal materials. Beetles develop by holometaboly, and parasitic species develop by a special type of holometaboly called hypermetamorphosis. I'll go into more detail on all these topics in just a bit. The term Coleoptera is a name that was given to them, to beetles, by Aristotle almost 2,400 years ago, and was later adopted by Carl Linnaeus in 1758 to encompass the entire group of beetles, what we call today an order. Beetles evolved around 327 million years ago. They began to thrive after acquiring plant cell wall-degrading enzymes that allowed them to eat plants. And as flowering plants evolved and became more diverse, so did beetles. And it's believed that the genes for these enzymes were probably acquired from fungi and bacteria. The order Coleoptera contains 4 suborders and 211 extant families. And of course, our classification is changing the more we learn about beetles. The 4 suborders is pretty much carved in stone, but the number of families will fluctuate. The suborder Archostomata is the most primitive of beetles. There are 5 families, one of which is found here in the United States, and we have 4 species across the US. Again, they're the most primitive beetles. They resemble the earliest beetle fossils, and they're typically associated with fungal-infested wood. The next suborder is the MYXOPHAGA, which contains 4 families and 80 species worldwide. They're incredibly small. They live in watery film on stream rocks and river stream debris, and they also inhabit interstitial habitats between sand grains. In other words, all those little tiny nooks and crannies in between wet sand, that's what they call home. The next suborder is the Adephaga, and it includes 11 families of beetles, and most adephagans are predatory, and they have an abdomen with pygidial defensive glands. These are glands that are located right at the tip of the abdomen that contain noxious fluids with which these beetles use to defend themselves. And there are approximately 34,000 species of adephagans worldwide. Finally, we have the last suborder, the suborder Polyphaga, with 151 families. Most polyphagan beetles are plant feeders, and this suborder contains the most species of economic and medical importance, and of course it's the largest suborder with well over 350,000 species worldwide. Now, just to go over the physical characteristics of beetles again, they have 2 pairs of wings. The hardened forewings are elytra, and underneath are the membranous hindwings. They also have chewing mouthparts, and they have antennae of diverse forms. I thought you would enjoy seeing this short video of a lady beetle unfolding its wings. As you can see, beetles on the outside are complex animals. They have lots of parts. We're going to look at some of these parts and explain their functions. If we consider the orientation of the mouth parts, that is, what direction the mouth parts are pointing in relation to the long axis of the body, their mouth parts are either prognathous, directed straight forward, or hypognathous, directed straight downward. And there are various mouth part orientations in between. Some beetles have their mouth parts on the very tip of a long rostrum. This is typical of weevils and some other beetles. And in some beetles, such as this blister beetle, their mouth parts are highly modified into a sucking tube. They still have chewing mouth parts, but they have a tongue-like structure that enables them to suck nectar from flowers. And many beetles, especially the males, have greatly enlarged genitals, which I'll talk about their function momentarily. The antennae of beetles are incredibly diverse. These are the primary sensory organs of beetles next to their eyes. And the types of antennae tell us a lot about their identification. We use these different antennal types as characters to identify certain beetle groups. For example, if you look at the bead-like segments of these antennae here, these are referred to as maniliform or bead-like. These feathery antennae here are pectinate or bitectinate, feathery antennae. These swollen clubs here are called clubbed antennae or capitate. You can see the sawtoothed edges on this click beetle. These are referred to as serrate antennae and so on. My favorite group of beetles, the scarab beetles, have lamellate antennae, where the terminal segments consist of flattened plates that can expand out into a fan or be folded tightly into a club. Down here we have this weevil that has elbowed antennae. These are referred to as geniculate antennae. The eyes of beetles help them see the world. Typically, most adult beetles have compound eyes, and when I say compound eyes, that refers to the multiple facets that you see on the outside. Each one of these facets is a lens that sits atop a tubular structure called an ommatidium. And in short, these lenses allow light through this crystalline cone, which focuses the light on the rhabdom and directs it to the optic nerve. And in some beetles, the eyes, the compound eyes, are highly modified. For example, in whirligig beetles, I'm sure many of you have seen whirligig beetles gyrating wildly on the surface of the water. Their compound eyes are divided completely in two. And the visual features of the upper portion of the eye are specifically adapted to see in the air, while those that are beneath the water's surface are specifically adapted for seeing in water. As I mentioned before, beetles typically have two pairs of wings. The forewings are modified into hard shell-like or thickened leathery elytra. And sometimes those elytra are shortened, as we see in rove beetles. Typically, rove beetles have very short elytra, and you can see the abdomen underneath. Beneath the elytra, whether they're fully developed or abbreviated like these in the rove beetles, they have these membranous flight wings that they extend. Now, some beetles have greatly reduced elytra, such as this female firefly. And this female glowworm here, this is an adult beetle, but it lacks elytra altogether. The legs of beetles tell us about how they live, especially modifications of those legs. The long, slender cursorial legs of tiger beetles are adapted for running, while the rake-like forelegs of dung beetles are adapted for digging. These are referred to as fossorial legs. And the paddle-like legs of whirligig beetles and other aquatic beetles are natatorial legs. These are legs that are adapted for swimming. Some beetles have exaggerated legs, either forelegs or hind legs. These are typically found in males and presumably are involved in their courtship behavior. On the end of the legs are claws, and as you can see in this series of photographs here, the claws are quite different. Some of them are toothed or split on the end. Others have comb-like edges, referred to as pectinate or serrate, and so on. And claws, of course, help beetles hang on to the world. They help them grip their food plant or one another as they're mating or fighting. The riot of colors seen in beetles is nothing short of extraordinary. The colors of beetles are the result of either chemical pigments found in their bodies that are often derived from their food plants, or the actual physical nature of their exoskeleton that bends and manipulates light, resulting in iridescent colors. If we consider the size of beetles, probably at the top of the list would be the Hercules beetle, found in Central and South America. The largest males, including the horn, will reach nearly 7 inches in length. The females lack horns, and the grubs are huge. The Hercules beetle was described by Carolus Linnaeus in 1758. In fact, these are the specimens that he examined. These are in a collection in Sweden. These are the specimens that he examined to write up his scientific description. And of course, today, people are breeding these all across the country, and people keep them as pets. Another big beetle, its name says it all, Titanus giganteus, is found in northern South America. This beetle was considered to be very rare until the advent of electrical lights showing up deep in the recesses of the Amazon rainforest, which attracted these big beetles. Very little is known about their biology. The larva is still unknown, although it's presumed to be a wood borer. The mandibles of this beetle are incredibly powerful and can snap a number 2 pencil with ease. Goliath beetles are one of my favorites. I got to see a Goliath beetle in the wild when I was a student in southern Africa. They are literally a handful. All Goliath beetles are found in Africa. In the old days, when they were just starting to collect these beetles, it was very difficult to get to them high up in the trees where they're feeding on fruits or sapping wounds. And so collectors would shoot them down with birdshot. And this technique was sort of forgotten, and years later, a specimen was discovered in the British Museum in London that was full of holes. The curators had noticed the holes before, but never really understood what they were about. And they x-rayed one of the beetles and found that it contained birdshot. Going to the other end of the spectrum is this featherwing beetle, Cytocella, or Cytocella, excuse me. The smallest of these beetles measures in at a whopping 325 microns in length. That is just barely over 1/100th of an inch. And for comparison, I've shown 5 strands of human hair magnified. On the average, human hair is about 70 microns in length. So if you put 5 human hairs together, they will represent in their combined width the total length of the world's smallest beetle, which is also the world's smallest insect. Beetles are found worldwide. They live on all continents except Antarctica. And across those continents, they're found in nearly every habitat type except for ice sheets and polar deserts. In terms of reproduction, most beetles reproduce sexually and invest an enormous amount of time and energy into finding a mate, copulation, and reproduction. Many beetles produce scents called pheromones to attract mates and or find them when they congregate at feeding sites, such as piles of dung or dead animals or flowers. Intersexual selection usually involves males of the same species competing with one another for mates. And in these species, we often see exaggerated development of horns and mandibles. These elaborate physical features are not associated with survival, but are used primarily in sexual competition. In other words, they're used against other males of the same species for the rights to mate with nearby females. It's interesting to note that the thoracic horns of beetles are derived from tissues that are comparable to other thoracic tissues that gave rise to wings. If we look at the scanning electron micrographs of a collection of horns on different types of dung beetles, they've been artificially colored so you can clearly see them. Notice the different horns that are found on the head. Studies have shown that the more elaborate the horn structure on the head, the smaller the eyes. There's only so much material available for the head to form. And so if a particular species has genes that dictate elaborate horns be developed, that's going to cost the beetle elsewhere. And the structure that is diminished are the eyes. But there's not much for these beetles to see anyway, because they use these horns to block tunnels in the ground. Past them is the female preparing a brood chamber with dung balls, and the males are standing guard to prevent other males from coming in and attempting to mate with them. Speaking of mate guarding, this is a behavior we see in tiger beetles. Here we have a female tiger beetle being mate guarded by a male. Notice that he has her firmly in his grip with her mandibles, with his mandibles. She has a groove on her thorax that corresponds perfectly with his mandibles. After they mate, the male remains with the female until she lays her eggs, thus assuring his paternity. Because fertilization doesn't occur while they're copulating. Fertilization only occurs as the eggs are being passed through her reproductive tract. Firefly courtship involves bioluminescence, and I'm hoping that many of you are enjoying the spectacular firefly show right now. Here on the north side of Richmond in Virginia, we've been regaled with great firefly shows here. It's really a good year for fireflies. So this production of light is referred to as bioluminescence, and adults use bioluminescence in part to attract and locate mates. Each species of fireflies has its own particular signal, and these signals are produced as a continuous glow or a series of discrete flashes. So if you watch the fireflies in your yard or when you're out in the woods, pay attention to what kind of a flash pattern your firefly is displaying. And yes, fireflies are beetles. They are in the order Coleoptera, the family Lampyridae. They're soft beetles. Their elytra are soft and leathery, and they have a pair of flight wings folded underneath, but they are definitely beetles. And do you say firefly or lightning bugs? I happen to say fireflies. It's what I learned growing up in Southern California, where seeing fireflies was a very rare event indeed. But depending on where you live, you may have grown up calling them fireflies or lightning bugs. But it's important to keep in mind that fireflies and lightning bugs are neither flies nor are they bugs. They are beetles. Now we have different types of fireflies, and they're active different times of the day. Diurnal fireflies, for example, are out during the daytime, and they don't produce light as adults. But crepuscular fireflies, those that are active at dusk and those that fly through the night, nocturnal species, are all bioluminescent. Probably the best known firefly that we have here in the East is commonly called the Big Dipper firefly. That's Photinus piralis. And it's so named because of its dipping flight. And as it descends, it turns on its light, then suddenly begins to ascend, forming this sort of J-shaped pattern. And they sort of hover along hedges, waiting for a female within view to signal back. So again, the light produced by fireflies is called bioluminescence. And this light is produced as a result of a chemical reaction involving oxygen, calcium, ATP, luciferin, and the presence of luciferase, a bioluminescent enzyme. And unlike a light bulb that loses a lot of energy as heat, a firefly's light is cold and loses very little energy as heat. So feeding that fire is an intricate tracheal system. Now, if we look at insects in general, we can see that insects breathe through a series of holes along the sides of their abdomen called spiracles. And these holes or spiracles connect internally to a series of tubes called trachea that get smaller and smaller and branch into the body until they become tracheoles. And each tracheole, each of the finest tubes, attaches to an individual cell. So oxygen is transported throughout the insect's body through this tracheal system, and then carbon dioxide is released through this very same system. Now, you've had a chance to see this katydid on a windshield breathing. Notice how its abdomen expands and contracts like a bellows. You can see it breathing as it's taking in air, oxygen, and expelling carbon dioxide. Well, beetles do the same thing, although it may be difficult to see. But the tracheal system that's associated with the light-producing organs in its abdomen are incredibly complex. And this is so they have plenty of oxygen to get that chemical reaction kick-started in their light-producing organ. And the amount of oxygen is controlled by the nervous system. And so this is what helps to control the very specific, or produce the very specific flash pattern for each species. Bioluminescence in fireflies also warns predators that adult fireflies taste bad. They have chemicals in their body that help protect them, and the light serves as a warning to would-be predators that they taste bad. This is what we call aposematism, and I'll talk more about that later. Now, in spite of their bad taste, fireflies still have enemies. They're preyed upon by insects and arachnids, spiders and their relatives, and they're even preyed upon by other fireflies. Here on the East Coast, we have two genera, Photurus and Photinus. Actually, we have many more genera than that. But the female Photurus that you see on the left lacks a defensive chemical needed to protect their eggs. To obtain this chemical, she switches her light signal to that of the male of another species in the genus Photinus, and lures in that mate, that male, not as a mate, but as a meal. Once sated, she has chemical in her body. She switches her signal to that of that will attract a male of her own kind and draw him in as a mate. The females need this chemical that they can pass on to their eggs, so they will be chemically defended as they develop. Now, speaking of close encounters of the wrong kind, to get off fireflies for a moment, Gulodimorpha saundersi is a jewel beetle found in Western Australia. And the male jewel beetle has evolved to seek mates that are as large as possible and have these dimpled elytra. And so entomologists and naturalists began to discover that the male beetles were often misdirecting their amorous activities at beer bottles that were discarded on the beach. Beer bottles often have these dimpled bottoms, and the males would get confused and try to mate with these beer bottles. Years ago, somebody gave me this bottle of beer, and it had a beetle on it. People give me beetle things all the time, and I'm afraid I wasn't paying close attention to it at the time, stuck it in a cupboard. Years later, I was cleaning out that cupboard and realized, wait a minute, I recognize that beetle. This is Julodimorpha. There's a story behind it, and this is the story that I just shared with you. And the story of this beetle is so well known that it appears on a postage stamp in Australia. Now, not all beetles reproduce sexually. Some beetles reproduce by parthenogenesis. In some weevils and a few other beetles, the females are capable of producing viable eggs without fertilization. Now, parthenogenesis in these beetles may be obligatory. That means males don't exist, or it can be facultative. That means males exist, but they may be in very small numbers, and if not readily available, the females will just go ahead and reproduce without them. So let's talk about the development of beetles, what we call holometabolous development. Some of you might know it as complete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis is how butterflies and moths, ants, bees, and wasps, fleas, flies, and beetles all develop. And these insects have four very distinct stages in their life cycle: eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. And most beetles spend the bulk of their lives as larvae. For example, you can see in this chart on the right, Japanese beetles. You'll see that we expect to see Japanese beetles emerging anytime now. And they'll be out in June and July mating, and they'll lay their eggs in the soil, and those eggs will hatch into grubs. And you can see that those root-feeding grubs will spend the rest of the year developing in the soil. Then they'll pupate in spring, and only later, a year from now, will the adults begin to emerge again. For most beetles, this is typical. They spend most of their lives as larvae hidden away. So here's the life cycle that I mentioned. Remember, they are holometabolous insects. So beetles start out as eggs. The eggs hatch into a larvae. The larva develops into a pupa, and then the pupa becomes an adult. When the adult first emerges from the pupa, it's said to be teneral. Its exoskeleton is very soft. It's very pale. And it goes through a chemical hardening process in which, in a matter of hours or days, it darkens and hardens. Now, the larvae of beetles are just as diverse as the adults are, but they can be roughly grouped into several categories based on their overall form. Campodiform beetle larvae are those that are long and slender and very leggy. We see these in beetle larvae that are predators or are parasites. They are immature stages that are on the move. They need these long legs to help them get around and get around quickly. Eruciform larvae are those that resemble caterpillars of butterflies and moths, but they tend to have much more developed legs. This is the larva of a lady beetle. Elateriform larvae have long, slender bodies with very short legs. They've got very tough exoskeletons. Some of you might know them as wireworms. Wireworms develop into click beetles. Another larva that some of you might be familiar with are mealworms that you can buy in the pet store and use to feed pets, or some of you might use them as bait for fishing. And of course, C-shaped grubs with legs and distinct head capsules are referred to as scarabiform. And that's because this is the typical form of scarab beetles, June bugs, June beetle, May beetles, and their relatives. Now, I alluded to hypermetamorphosis earlier. Hypermetamorphosis is a special type of holometaboly that occurs typically in parasitic beetles, where the successive larval stages differ in form. So rather than the larvae developing and just becoming bigger and bigger larvae until they pupate, each larval stage looks very different from the previous stage. The first larval instar, that's the one that hatches from the egg, is an active and leggy campodiform larva that's called the triangulin. Here's the triangulin here. Here's the triangulin of this desert blister beetle here. The triangulin's job, if you will, is to find the right host. Remember, they're largely parasites, and so they'll run around on the ground, look for burrows, climb up into flowers, wherever they find the right, normally insect host, to begin their lives. Once they are carried to the host's nest or burrow, they will molt again, and they become a more sedentary larval form. This leggy campodiform larva is so named because these very primitive insect relatives in the genus Campodea sort of resemble these campodiform larvae or triangulins. Just when you thought things couldn't get weirder, telephone pole beetles also develop by hypermetamorphosis, but they're not parasites. The larvae of these beetles develop in really punky, fungal-infested wood. And the female larvae may develop into 3 different forms, and each of those larvae are capable of reproduction by either laying eggs or giving live birth to more larvae without mating. This is incredibly unusual. Insects typically only reproduce as adults, but here we have larval insects that are capable of reproducing asexually without mating. The ability to reproduce as adults or larvae in telephone pole beetles enables them to multiply quickly and exploit patchy ephemeral food sources, because those rotten, punky logs aren't going to stay that way for long. If we look at the feeding habits of different beetles, most beetles are herbivores. And depending on the species, they feed on different parts of the plant. Many herbivores are leaf chewers. And beetles will either chew the edges of leaves or they'll gouge chunks in between the veins, such as these Japanese beetles. This feeding habit is called skeletonization because it leaves the veins behind. And then other beetles just sort of graze on the leaf surfaces, leaving these patches. Some specialist herbivores feed on plants that are somehow defended against most herbivores. Plants aren't just sitting ducks. I know that's a poor analogy there, but they're not defenseless. Many plants are chemically or physically defended to repel plant-feeding species. But for insects that are specialists on these plants, who have evolved and adapted to these plants' defenses, they work around them. For example, there are a number of beetles that feed on milkweeds, which are known to have milky, sticky sap that's toxic. In the case of red milkweed beetles, the adults will go down to the base of the leaf and they chew on this midrib and they drain the sticky latex from the leaf, and then the beetle will start feeding on the tip of the leaf. In the case of the milkweed leaf beetle, it just goes ahead and eats the leaves, and it concentrates the plant's toxins into feces. And then when the females lay their eggs, they coat those eggs with feces to chemically protect them. In other words, they're co-opting the plant's defense mechanism and using it themselves to protect their offspring. Now, specialist herbivores, those that feed on just one or a few species within a single genus, are of great interest as biological controls. Biological controls are organisms that we use against species that we consider to be pests, either plants or animals. Biological controls help us become less reliant upon pesticides and other chemical controls. But I want to mention just for a second here that pests are strictly from our point of view. And in the case of pestiferous plants or weeds, weeds are simply plants growing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Somewhere in the world, they're exactly where they belong, doing what they should be. But here in North America, we've imported European species of leaf beetles that are specialists upon Klamath weed and St. John's wort, two weedy species that are slowly taking over pastures in different parts of the country. Other leaf feeders are leaf miners. And typically it's not the adults that mine leaves, it's the larvae. And when I'm talking about leaf miners, I'm talking about immature beetles that make their homes inside the upper and lower surfaces of the leaves, and they often leave these trailing patterns on the leaf surface. And these patterns are often very characteristic, and to a knowledgeable entomologist, you can identify the producer of that mine by looking at the pattern that it leaves behind and also the species of plant that's being mined. Some beetles, as adults, specialize or spend much of their time feeding on fruit. And one of the well-known beetles in the West is the green peach beetle, Cutinus metabulus. They feed on peaches and figs and other soft-bodied fruit. We have a cousin of this beetle, the green June beetle, that's found here in eastern United States. Now, many herbivores are wood borers, primarily as larvae that chew through living or dead or dying wood, and they utilize different parts of the plants in different ways. Sometimes they bore through the roots or limbs or trees or cones and have you. Bark and ambrosia beetles are an interesting group. They are serious pests throughout the world, especially when they are living in forests that are managed for timber. But they rely on a symbiotic fungus that they carry with them in special depressions on the inside of the body called mycangia. And the mycangia are used by these beetles to transport fungal material and inoculate new substrates. So they'll inoculate wood, and the fungus breaks down the wood, making it easier to eat and more nutritious for the bark beetles and their larvae. Here are the brood chambers of the engraver beetle. You can see the primary chamber right here where the female laid her eggs on the sides of the chamber. She just chewed little divots along the side, laid an egg, and those larvae hatched and began chewing their way away from the brood chamber, leaving these very characteristic patterns. Here you can see the larvae here. Some herbivores like their plant materials highly processed through the gastrointestinal system of some herbivore. Here we have a mass of dung beetles on a pile of elephant dung in southern Africa. Some of these beetles will roll the balls of dung away. The interest of these beetles in dung is twofold. One, it provides sustenance for themselves. They have specialized mandibles that they use to strain nutritious fluids from the fibrous dung, and they also prepare the dung as the sole food source for their developing larvae. Now, if we look at the nesting behaviors or nesting strategies of dung beetles, there are three large groups that overlap one another somewhat. But in this group here, these are called paracoprids. And that's because they'll find a dung pat, and then the females will dig burrows or tunnels either beside or underneath the pat and supply them with dung balls for their larvae. Telecoprids will carve out a chunk of dung, carefully roll it up with their modified legs and into a ball, and then roll it away to minimize the amount of competition for this very short-lived food source, lay an egg inside, and then they bury that dung ball. Endocoprids don't do any such thing. They simply dive right into the poo and carve out chambers within the dung and produce their brood balls. Dung beetles are of great interest as biocontrols because of their dung-bearing activities. They're used in pasture situations to help bury dung on ranches and dairy cattle concerns before fly populations can build up. And also when they bury the dung, they help recycle nutrients that were passed through the gut of the herbivorous animal, and so they recycle those nutrients, and this helps the pasture to be very productive and provide a better quality of food for the animals that are grazing upon it. There are a number of beetles that are considered to be fungivores. Beetles that eat fungi and slime molds are called fungivores or mycophages. Microphages gather small fungal particles such as spores and hyphal fragments, while macrophages are species that utilize fungal bodies, think mushrooms and the like, that must be torn apart with very powerful mandibles. Moving on to carnivores, there are a smaller subset of beetles, approximately a quarter of all known beetles, are predators. This is a ground beetle known as the caterpillar hunter, and it's up to its eyeballs literally in a hornworm caterpillar. You can see the guts of the caterpillar and its trachea exposed there as the beetle is chewing along it. Some beetles are specialist carnivores. For example, this odd-looking beetle here that we have several species across the United States is referred to as glowworm, and that's because the larvae and the larviform females look like this. And the larvae glow. Instead of having just one light-producing organ at the tip of the abdomen, they have a series of lights along the side of their abdomen. The larvae are millipede predators. They will run alongside of a millipede who is also running full out, loop their body around the head of the millipede, and then very quickly take very sharp mandibles and bite the membrane underneath the millipede's head and inject a toxin that immediately stuns the millipede and kills it. Then the larva of the glowworm pushes the head back and then burrows right into the body cavity of the millipede, feeding on its tissues and organs, leaving nothing behind but just a series of body rings in its wake. The larvae of select families of beetles are parasitoids. Now, parasitoids live at the expense of only one animal or the host eventually killing it. Parasites typically don't kill their host, but parasites do. And depending on where this parasitoid larva lives in relation to its host, whether it's inside or outside the host body, it's referred to as an ectoparasitoid, outside the body, or an endoparasitoid, inside the body. Many species of blister beetles, cicada parasite beetles, and wedge-shaped beetles are parasitoids. Their larvae are parasitoids on other insects. In the case of blister beetles, larvae are parasitoids of grasshopper egg cases or ground nesting bees. Cicada parasite beetles tells you everything you need to know there. And in wedge-shaped beetles, the larvae of these insects are parasitoids upon wasps, including mud daubers and organ pipe mud daubers. There are even a few species that are parasites or live in mammal nests. This insect here is the beaver parasite beetle. It looks very much like a flea, and it lives on the bodies of beavers even when they're submerged in the water. And this beetle here is a mammal nest beetle. It's typically found in the nest, but they will go on the bodies of mice and other rodents and feed on little exudates from wounds and lesions on their bodies. Now, some beetles prefer their flesh very cured and in the form of dead. There are a number of beetles that interact with carrion or dead animals. Insect predators, parasites, and necrophages are all attracted to carrion. And necrophages are organisms that feed on the flesh of dead animals. So some beetles are specialists and feed only on the remains of dead animals. But some, such as this carrion or burrowing beetle here, not only feed on carrion, but they will also feed on fly eggs and larvae. And rove beetles and clown beetles, hister beetles, are also visit carrion primarily as predators, not to scavenge a carcass. The orderly ecological succession of flies, beetles, and other insects at a corpse, human remains, is characterized by a gradual and continuous gain and loss of taxa over time. Different species come and go as the corpse dries out. This predictable succession provides clues as to the time and place of death that are used in medical legal investigations by forensic entomologists. Now, forensic entomologists have become popular fodder for TV and film, but actually forensic entomologists do a lot more than sort out insects associated with dead bodies, but it's certainly one of the things that they are known for. Let's take a look at how beetles defend themselves. They'll use jaws, claws, horns, and spines. For example, here is a male stag beetle. They have these massive horns that are almost equal their body in length. We've got the Hercules beetle that we met earlier. The males also have this long pair of horns that they can use to pinch. Remember, these organs are used primarily in battles with other males to mate with nearby females, but if they have to, they can certainly use them as weapons to defend themselves. Both of these beetles are incredibly strong, and they can use their powerful legs and sharp claws to defend themselves too. Here you can see some other horn beetles, and notice again that these horns more or less oppose another structure, so they can be used pincher-like. And here we've got a spiny leaf beetle that would be a real mouthful. It would be like taking in a small pincushion. These beetles are relatively small, about 1/4 inch in length, but still would be an uncomfortable mouthful for a hungry predator. Now, many beetles have chemical defenses. They produce chemicals in their body that make them smell and or taste bad. Probably one of the best known chemically defended beetles are bombardier beetles in the genus Brachinus. And they release small boiling clouds of caustic hydrogen peroxide gas mixed with hydroquinones and various enzymes with considerable accuracy through an anal turret. Yes, I said anal turret. If you look at what's going on here, it's aiming its anus right at these forceps pulling on its leg, just as if an ant was pulling on its leg. Just spray these chemicals. It aims the chemicals directly at its attacker. Other beetles also have pygidial glands. This is a darkling beetle from the southwest. Sometimes they're called clown beetles. In Spanish, they're referred to as the pinacate beetle. They're referred to as clown beetles because when they're defending themselves, they have the habit of standing on their head, and then they release an oily, smelly fluid from the tip of their abdomen that can deter small animals, mammals from eating them, and it can irritate human skin if you carelessly handle them. Some beetles engage in what we call reflex bleeding. For example, blister beetles and lady beetles have their blood, which we call hemolymph, laced with distasteful compounds, and it's bled through or exuded their femorotibial joints. That's a fancy term for their knee joints, which would be right here on the blister beetle. Blister beetles release caustic cantharidin, while lady beetles produce bitter tasting and irritating alkaloids. I suspect most of you haven't picked up a blister beetle, but I'm betting you have handled a lady beetle or a ladybug. They're actually beetles from time to time at some point in your history, and notice that they leave a yellow stain on your fingers or an orange stain. Next time you pick up a lady beetle, do so gently, and when they produce that fluid, take a quick whiff, and you'll get a very bitter smell, and you'll learn very quickly why most animals don't eat lady beetles. I mentioned earlier that bioluminescence in fireflies, at least in the adults, not only helps them find mates, but it also serves as a feeding deterrent. It's worth noting that in species of fireflies for which the immature stages are known, that is the eggs, larvae, and pupae, all are bioluminescent. And so for all stages of the firefly's life, bioluminescence serves as an aposematic warning. It's letting hungry predators know that all stages of its life are chemically defended and they taste bad. If you handle a firefly, gently of course, but if you handle them, they will produce droplets of bitter fluid on their bodies. And that goes for the light-producing fireflies, as well as the daytime, day-active dark fireflies. Now, a number of species of beetles that are chemically defended advertise the fact that they are chemically defended through warning colors. And we call these aposematic warning colors or aposematism. Sometimes aposematism can be a behavior, it can be a color, or it can be in the form of bioluminescence. And in this case, these are beetles that are chemically defended, and they move about slowly and obviously to let predators know that they taste bad. Of course, there are a number of fakers out there too that mimic these beetles, and they are not chemically defended, yet they hope to fool potential predators that they taste bad. For example, there are a number of insects that are firefly mimics. Fireflies are chemically defended, they taste bad. And here you can see a number of beetles that may or may, in fact, most of these are not chemically defended, and yet they look like fireflies. They have the same bold color patterns. Here's a moth that closely resembles a firefly. This moth is distasteful, so it's a different type of mimicry that we call Mullerian mimicry. That's where everybody that resembles one another, they're all chemically defended. But in species where you have one distasteful model and lots of tasty mimics, we refer to that type of mimicry as Batesian mimicry. Here's a cockroach that mimics a firefly. Beetles sometimes get our attention because there are invasive species that were accidentally, for the most part, introduced into a country where they don't belong. So I'm going to focus on 4 of the most notorious invasive beetles here in the United States. Japanese beetles were first found in the US in 1916 in a nursery in New Jersey, but it's likely they were introduced several years earlier as larvae in a shipment of iris bulbs from Japan. The grubs feed on the grass roots and damage lawns, golf courses, and pastures, and the adults attack all parts of plants of more than 300 species of ornamental and agricultural plants. The emerald ash borer has certainly gotten a lot of attention lately. It was first detected in Michigan in 2002, and it threatens all, I want to emphasize all, North American species of ash in the genus Fraxinus. To date, it has killed up to 100 million ash trees and thus far threatens to kill most of the 7.5 billion ash trees estimated to inhabit the United States and Canada. And the emerald ash borer probably arrived in packing containers with automotive parts from Japan. It's typically these items packed in cheap wooden crates. The wood is supposed to be heat treated to prevent this sort of thing, but obviously this wasn't the case. These are purple prism traps that are set out everywhere with an attractant inside to lure female emerald ash borers, and the insides of these cardboard panels are sticky. So when the females fly in and other insects too, they become trapped. And agricultural inspectors can come along and see if there are emerald ash borers in the area. And I want to emphasize, kiss your ash goodbye. Here's the current distribution as we know it, primarily in eastern United States, but they are slowly moving south and west. It's only a matter of time before they spread throughout much of North America. Ash is an incredibly important tree. It's an important street tree. It's an important harvested lumber. It's used for flooring, musical instruments, tool handles, furniture, baseball bats, you name it. It's all going to go away. Even if you've been up to the upper Midwest or driven up to New England, you'll note that there's a lot of dead trees that are clearly visible from the interstates. Many of those are ash trees that have succumbed to the emerald ash borer. The small hive beetle is a small species native to sub-Saharan Africa. It was first discovered in the United States in the mid-1990s. The larvae will tunnel through the comb stored with honey, and they discolor it with their feces. The fouled honey becomes frothy and smells like rotten oranges, and eventually the bees will abandon the hive. Currently, it's found mostly in eastern United States, but it is starting to pop up in the West. Finally, we have the Asian longhorn beetle. Again, native to Asia. Asian longhorn beetles were first discovered in 1996, attacking ornamental trees in New York City and Chicago. To deal with this species, the only way to do it, at least in terms of street trees, is removing the street tree and completely destroying it. At great expense, it must be chipped, and the chips are then burned. And this costs several $100s per tree to remove it, destroy it, and then replace it. The economic impact of forest ecosystems would be far greater. The maple syrup industry is at risk. In terms of their public health importance, the larvae of skin beetles are covered with irritating bristles that can cause skin and respiratory Allergies, you might find these beetles dead or alive in your windowsills. They look like small ladybugs, but are much more somberly colored. If you find these or the cast exoskeletons, that means you have some animal-based product that's infested, whether you have furs or an insect collection or some sort of protein source. Some of the strange things that happen with beetles, scarabaeosis is an uncommon condition that occurs in infants in parts of Asia and Africa. And this occurs when small, I mean tiny, adult dung beetles are attracted to fecal odors, and they actually enter the anus of the infant, causing diarrhea, loss of appetite, abdominal cramps, and fever. Again, I want to emphasize it happens, but it's rare. More often, there have been several of scarecrows crawling into the ear of people at outdoor events, causing pain and some bleeding as a result of the tearing action of their tibial spines. The greatest discomfort associated with beetles is caused by vesicatory species that secrete chemicals that irritate human skin and other sense organs. And there are a number of families that do this. But before I talk about them, I want to emphasize the difference between venomous and poisonous. These terms are not interchangeable. There's a difference between a venomous insect or arthropod and a poisonous arthropod. Both venomous and poisonous arthropods produce toxins that are injurious or even lethal to other organisms. Venoms are toxins that are injected into animal tissues via specialized structures. These could be stings or modified fangs or spines that we see in caterpillars. Venoms are injected by special structures. Poisonous organisms don't deliver their toxins directly. Their entire body or large parts of it may contain poisonous substances, and there are poisonous beetles. Blister beetles occur worldwide and produce the terpene cantharidin that causes skin irritations ranging from tingling and burning to itching and oozing lesions. Cantharidin is a toxin present in the hemolymph or the blood of blister beetles, and is exuded as a clear yellowish secretion from the knees. It's secreted by the male and passed to the female during courtship. Probably the world's best known blister beetle is the Spanish fly from Europe, Leda vesicatoria. And this is a species that has had medicinal uses for centuries. And even today, there are products that claim to have Spanish fly in it, but do not. It's a very toxic substance. The Roman naturalist Pliny noted that blister beetles were poisonous when taken internally, and also recorded that when combined with other materials could be used to treat various ailments. In ancient Greece, Dioscorides noted that beetles with cantharidin were prepared in different ways and used in medications to treat leprosy, carcinomas, herpes, and edema. Again, cantharidin is a terpenoid derived from the bodies of several types of blister beetles that are common in Asia and Europe and Africa. Long used in Europe and Africa as an aphrodisiac, cantharidin is more likely to cause illness or death as a result of kidney failure. Modern practitioners of traditional medicine in China and Vietnam use cantharidin to treat esophageal cancer, liver cancer, and skin diseases. In dermatology, cantharidin has long been applied topically to treat warts. Pardon me. I've had my own experience with blister beetles. We sometimes set up lights at night to attract all kinds of insects. I was doing just that in southeastern Arizona. One night, thousands of blister beetles came to light. I was on high alert. I thought I dodged a bullet and checked myself carefully, but apparently not carefully enough. I woke up with a start 5:30 the next morning, as if somebody had taken a lit match and dragged it across the base of my neck. And I had this burn. Apparently there was a blister beetle trapped in my clothing. There is one venomous beetle discovered only recently, and this is a longhorn beetle that has a stinging apparatus at the tip of its antennae. And the stinging apparatus is analogous to that of a scorpion. The details of the venom haven't been studied yet, but here's a finger that was pricked and it swelled up almost immediately, and then it quickly subsided. Just to wrap up here, the scientific value of beetles is enormous, and I just want to cover a couple of the topics. Beetles are used as taxonomic and systematic models. In other words, we study beetles to develop systems that enable us to create informed hypotheses as to their evolutionary relationships. Because beetles are so diverse, because they have an enormous array of physical and geographical and behavioral and biochemical characteristics that we could compare to infer their evolutionary relationships, they're a great testing ground for developing these theories and models, which then can be applied to other organisms. Their bodies are amazing. The ironclad beetle is so named because it is rock hard. It can be run over by a car and not crushed. And lately, scientists have been studying the joint of the sealed elytra of these beetles to get a better understanding how this beetle can withstand these tremendous pressures and possibly use this information to create more structurally sound engineering, more structurally sound buildings. The materials that beetles produce have practical value. For example, the materials that are found in the bioluminescence of fireflies has long been used to test food safety. These tests using these products detect the presence of bacteria and produce a light signal if bacterial contamination is detected. A similar test has been sent to Mars and is operating right now on NASA's Perseverance. Should the sensors come into contact with living organisms of some sort, presumably they will light up or react in such a way to be detected by scientists here on Earth. Chemicals found in the light-producing organs of jellyfish and fireflies are injected into human tissues to help detect disease cells. The medicinal potential of insects is enormous. They use these chemicals and have so for millennia just to protect themselves from all kinds of hazards in their environments. And only recently have we begun to realize the medical potential of these chemicals for our own purposes. For example, insect cytotoxins of medicinal interest include cantharidin, which we've already discussed, fatty acids produced by scarab grubs, and pityrin produced by Pityris rove beetles. These have very important and potentially groundbreaking results in the laboratory and hopefully in patients. And also, beetles' bodies have inspired technological inspirations. For example, this fog basking beetle that will crawl up at night on the crests of dunes. When the fog rolls in, the water vapor condenses on its back and the water trickles down over its mouth and it drinks. This is the only free water it'll ever see in its life. A company developed a stainless steel dome called the dew bank that mimics the elytral ridges of these fog beetles. And the dome is cooler than the morning air, resulting in the formation of condensation that runs into a collection channel around the bottle. And under ideal conditions, the dew bank bottle harvests about a cup of water at a time, which can be important in areas that have very poor water sources. And when not in use, the dew bank bottle can be used as a bowl. Finally, penultimately, here's some technology inspired by beetle feet. Many beetles have sticky pads made up of brushes of hair-like setae that increase their adhesiveness on plant tissues and other surfaces. Engineers have developed a sticky tape without any adhesive that mimics the flattened hair-like structures on the beetle's feet, forming these mini suction cups, if you will. Dust particles that are on the surface are simply pushed up in between these pillars, making the adhesive tape dust-proof. And when you're done using the tape, you can peel it off the surface and then wash it with soap and water and reuse it. All things you can't do with normal adhesive tapes. And you can see this tape is very powerful. Finally, I put in a big plug for fireflies tonight. Not only are they interesting, they have fascinating behaviors, but they also have chemicals that we use in our lives that help us keep us safe and help us with exploration. The light-producing organs of fireflies have ridged scales on the exoskeleton outside that help magnify their light, making it even brighter. And engineers have copied this structure and used it to make more efficient and brighter LED lights. It was all I could do to limit what I talk about with beetles, because they are so fascinating. They are so diverse, and there are lifetimes of work that have gone into studying them already, and there's still lifetimes to go in learning more about them and how they make our world a better place. But I'm going to stop here, and I will be happy to, oops, I goofed. I missed a couple things. I'm sorry. I promise I won't do this again. Fireflies need our help. That's where I was going. Artificial lights and diffuse sky glow impact the behavior of fireflies and other insects. You can do a lot for fireflies by turning off all those lights you leave around your house burning all night. It makes it difficult for them to find one another, and it trips up the patterns of other insects too. You can make your backyard firefly friendly by reducing or eliminating the use of pesticides, creating habitats with native vegetation and shrubs and so on. And again, turn off all that lighting. Encourage fireflies and pollinators by going native. Plant those native plants. My mantra for the last couple of years is lose the lawn and leave the leaves. Leaf litter provides shelter for fireflies and other wildlife. It's a free source of mulch and fertilizer and so on. It soaks up rain, holds moisture in the ground. It's a win-win situation. Doug Tallamy, some of you might be familiar with his works, has really inspired me. He inscribed in my copy of his book, Bringing Nature Home, garden as if life depends on it. So often we think these conservation projects are beyond us, but there are things that we can be doing in our backyards right now. After the bar in our landscapes. In the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. Think globally, act locally. Okay, now I'll end it and be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you very much for stopping by tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Fascinating. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm just sort of getting acquainted here.
Yeah, that was amazing. We have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to go back to the beginning, but I'm going to start with my question because I'm the host. I'm guilty of watching BattleBots. You know this TV show?
I'm aware of it.
Engineers create little robots that then fight gladiators in a ring. I can't help noticing that many of the BattleBots that are successful resemble sort of horned beetles of one kind or another. So I thought that was interesting, like you were mentioning the engineering aspect. And they're so successful.
Beetles.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say beetles and cockroaches in particular, the way that their legs are attached to their bodies and the way they moved have been copied by bioengineers to create machines, robots that can work in hazardous places. And just off topic here, I just want to introduce everybody to my lovely wife, Paula. Because of her, I get to do all this beetle stuff.
Cool. Here's our first question from the audience. I'll put up on the screen.
Are beetles more prominent as forest decomposers or as predators for problem insects? Interesting question. The vast majority of beetles are herbivores one way or the other. So they are feeding on living, decaying, or dead tissues and breaking them down into smaller bits and recycling those nutrients for use by other organisms. So I would say on the whole, it would be the recycling of nutrients, but that's not to minimize the importance of predatory species in our forest systems. But again, we're looking at it from our own myopic point of view. You know, we focus on things that are eating things we don't want. You know, we tend to lose sight of the bigger picture, the things that they're doing that have nothing to do with us, which is most of it.
Yeah. This question you sort of answered, but it bears repeating because we had to see during the slides just the incredible diversity of coloration in beetles.
Oh, Louise Palermo. Hello, hello. I'm recognizing some names here from my past at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. Terrific. Yes, if I were a physicist or if I'd paid more attention in physics, I could probably do a better job. But as I mentioned earlier, colors fall into basically beetle colors fall into basically two categories: pigment colors based on chemicals that are in their tissues, which are largely derived from their foodstuffs. This is particularly so in herbivorous species. But then there are beetles that have special structures within or on their exoskeletons that bend light and different wavelengths of light. There are beetles, the exoskeleton is made up of different layers, lamina or plates, if you will, and the different qualities of these layers within the exoskeleton will reflect different wavelengths of light depending on what angle it's coming in. That's how you get iridescent colors. And so when you move around, you see all these different colors and it shifts. Then you have some species that have what they call photonic crystals. And these are physical structures that reflect light the same way, regardless of the angle of light or the viewpoint of the observer. These are beetles that are consistently metallic, regardless of what angle you're looking at them from. Some beetles have reflective pigmented fluids inside those plates in their exoskeletons, and through tiny gland or pores, they can shift those fluids away and change their color temporarily. I mean, it's just crazy. And I'm just learning more about this sort of thing myself.
Yeah, amazing. How do you account for the large size of some of the beetles? I mean, we learned last week that during the Carboniferous, there was a lot of oxygen and insects were bigger. How come beetles can get so big?
Well, speaking of the Carboniferous, you know, what limits the size of beetles and other insects is that respiratory system that I mentioned, the tracheal system. Because as insects get larger, the leg joints where they're attached to the body don't get the size at the same rate. So you have these 6 bottlenecks at the bases of their legs, and you've got to get air tubes, you've got to get blood, you've got to get nerves all in through there. And that's what limits the size of insects and beetles too. Why beetles continue to be as large as they are, I can't say, but I can't help but wonder how big they were way back when. But the largest beetles we have are primarily in the tropics. Although here in the United States, we do have both the eastern and western Hercules beetles. They are, you know, small in relation to their tropical cousins, but still among North America, they're impressive insects.
Yeah, and the grubs that fill your hand. The question was asked, and I wondered about that too. Are there people who eat those large?
Yes, there are people that eat beetle grubs. They, especially the larger ones, they're very rich in fats and minerals. Usually in this part of the world, people eat grubs because they've lost a bet or on a dare. But in other parts of the world, they're considered not only they're considered to be important sources of fats and minerals, and are considered to be a delicacy. Yeah.
Have you eaten a beetle grub?
I have, not many, just because I haven't had that many opportunities. I'm a creature of my own culture. I don't crave insects, but I don't turn them down when I have the opportunity. And they tend to taste like whatever they're cooked in. You know, everything's good in butter and garlic.
Like tofu. Which leads to this question, which, you know, I'm sure you get this a lot, but
what sparked my interest in beetles? Great question. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because I wrote about this in the preface to my Western beetle book. I ran into several people as a youth. I was interested in insects from a very early age, but I started running into more and more beetle people and beetle collections. And I liked the orderliness of a good collection. And those first collections were of beetles. And later, I just began to appreciate that they're incredibly diverse. Wherever you go, there they are. There's always something to learn and discover and look for. And from a practical sense, they're a lot easier to prepare as specimens than butterflies.
Okay. Here's a question about symbiosis.
Oh, how do specialized beetles like wood engravers help develop a relationship with the fungi? You know, how that starts, I don't know. I can only speculate, and I'm sure if there's anybody out there that knows better than I, they're already rolling their eyes. But I suspect that how some of these relationships start is because the ancestors of these organisms shared a similar habitat. And as a result, we're in regular contact with one another. And over the millennia, one thing leads to another, and you have a symbiotic relationship of one sort or another.
Here's another question about, can the chemicals that beetles emit be used this way?
Great. I can't think. I can't think of an example, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. So I can say with absolute authority, I don't know.
Let's see. Well, some people, when you were talking about the beetles that crawl in people's ears and other things, that they're going to have nightmares because, yeah, there was some scary stuff there.
Well, hopefully nothing I presented is the stuff of nightmares, but I'm hoping it will pique some curiosity.
Okay, here's another sort of evolutionary question.
Yeah, that's a great question. With all the beetles that are known, how come only one is venomous so far? Great question. I don't know. You know, because the definition of venomous is so precise that the venom has to be delivered through, you know, injected by a very specific structure. Beetles just don't have those. And it's interesting to note that I think there's 8 species in that same genus as the beetle I mentioned that has the stinging antennae. None of the other species have antennae that sting. They all have sharp points on the tips of the antennae, but that one species is the only one that flat out stings. So, you know, in the tropical rainforests, there are still so many things we have yet to discover. It's possible that we might find something else, but poisonous beetles are usually more the way to go. There are toxins in their in their tissues. That seems to be the way that most beetles have gone in terms of protecting themselves.
And a related question, sort of evolutionary.
What biology keeps beetles from being able to inhabit Arctic settings? It's just too cold. They're not able to. Their chemical systems, their physiological systems, just don't work. Now, having said that, there are some beetles that live in very cold climates and other insects too, and they have the ability to either produce basically antifreeze in their tissues to prevent ice crystals from building up and just slicing their tissues and turning their insides into mush, or they have the physiological capability of shunting water out of their tissues so harmful crystals develop between the cells and not inside the cells. But that's something that largely doesn't happen in most insects and even fewer beetles. But there are some exceptions out there. And also, what are they going to eat? there's nothing else that they'd just be eating themselves, you know, or you know, there's just nothing there. Tundra, there are beetles there. You know, in other high elevation habitats, as long as there are other organisms upon which they can scavenge or prey, you'll likely have some beetles.
And there's a comment from a future instructor, Eric Eaton.
Hey.
And he says this.
Hey, Eric. Let's see. Some larvae of diving beetles inject pyrrolic compounds in the prey to stop it from struggling. Yes. There are other beetles that I mentioned. The larva injects these similar acting chemicals in millipedes to stop them in their tracks and kill them. Millipedes typically protect themselves with these repugnatorial glands that exude a fluid on the side of their body. And the larvae stop them from doing that by paralyzing them right away.
Okay. And we'll have one final question, and then we're going to draw for the winners tonight. The final question has to do with the title of your early book. And I wondered that myself.
An inordinate fondness for beetles. JBS Haldane was a well-known English geneticist, and he was reported to have been asked by a cleric. He was also a well-known atheist. He was reportedly asked by a cleric, what does the study of the Lord's creation tell you about life? And he was reported to have replied, an inordinate fondness for beetles, in reference to that there are so many species of beetles. And we settled on that title for the book because it was just perfect. And months after we began writing, Stephen Jay Gould came out with a column in Natural History magazine debunking the whole thing. Apparently he never said it, but it was quoted back to Haldane several times, and he began quoting it himself. But what he said wasn't nearly as succinct or as elegant as an inordinate fondness for beetles, but it's stuck now. And there are other books that talk about well-known naturalists with a fondness for beetles. So it's, I've always liked it.
Well, I think you're giving us all a fondness for beetles tonight. Very good presentation. Thank you.
Great.
I'm going to draw now our first winner for the lady beetle adoption from the World Wildlife Fund. And the winner of that, and Louise asked, what if I win a book? Well, if you win something, send us a message through our wherever you're watching, and we'll get the book to you. Edie Banner is the winner of the Lady Beetle adoption. And now we'll give away Dr. Evans's book on the eastern beetles to...
Drum roll.
I should get a recorded drum roll for this. Diane Chambers.
All right.
So, like I said, give us a message and send us your address, and I'll get those out to everyone. Dr. Evans, that was an excellent present. I think we had more questions than we've had so far, so that shows a lot of engagement and interest, and we really appreciate it.
Well, I'm just glad I got through all 126 slides in an hour and 2 minutes.
I thought your slides were excellent, by the way. And I will say, in general, the slides for these
Thank you.
presentations
Well, I owe a lot.
Go ahead.
Well, I take a lot of pictures myself, but I owe a lot to very generous photographers out there that share their pictures with me or put them under Creative Commons licenses so we can all use them in our presentations. So thank you.
Excellent. So well done. And don't forget, next week, another Dr. Evans will be here to talk about bees, Hymenoptera. And then we have Robin Yoakum on Tuesday to talk about his novel. I want to remind you, you can win Bob Villamagnus cicada art by going to the library and taking a picture with our giant cicada, putting it online. And thanks, everyone, for attending, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean. Good night.
Great to meet you. Goodbye now.
Bye.